Lindsay, can you share your screen?
Yeah, let me, just a second. I have two screens up, so let me see which one. I'm going to be sure. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Christina and Kelvin and the whole OKEx team for inviting me to teach as part of the Beacon program. It's really my honor to be here with you all today. And from your introductions, it sounds like I'm not sure that I have more experience than you, but hopefully with my presentation today, you'll learn a bit about Korea and some of the facts of what was going on and what led to the ICO hype and the ICO mania in Korea. I believe that the format today is about 20 minutes for my presentation, and then we'll do some Q&A and discussion at the end. Uh, since this will be on YouTube, I guess that makes the most sense, is to just divide it in that nature. But please write down any questions that you have. I'd love to hear more about your feedback. And I understand from Matthew's class last week that you guys had a lot to talk about. So my brief introduction on who I am: my name is Lindsay Joo, and I started out in crypto in the summer of 2017 when I moved to Seoul, Korea. I actually came from traditional finance. I worked for a large US institution, and then I also worked in tech and software consulting. And so when I came to Korea, I felt like fintech was the best place for me. And lo and behold, what was happening at the time was ICO mania. So I just sort of fell down that rabbit hole. And since then, I've had the opportunity to work with CNBC Crypto Trader and reported with them, traveled to many events over the past couple of years to talk to some of the industry's leaders and find out what's going on in the industry. And then I'm also currently working with Logos Capital in Miami, Florida, and advising them on both blockchain and non-blockchain projects. So today, and I guess how my presentation is geared, I did originally call this Asia to the Americas, but for our time here, I'm just gonna shorten that down to my perspective on what was going on in Korea, and then also a little bit about how that shifts into the US. But we won't be taking on all of Asia and all of North and South America today, unfortunately. But if those of you who've been working in blockchain for a number of years know the philosophy, trust but verify. And I believe that that's just what I'm emphasizing here today, and our points around, how did this industry really take off, and what was the logic behind it, and really what's going to be sustainable in the future going forward. So I just encourage all of you to use that lens going forward, both in my presentation here today and as you continue to evaluate potentially future investments and other projects that you might come across or work with. Okay. So it does sound like many of you who are on the call today are familiar with ICOs or initial coin offerings, but just for those who will be listening on YouTube later, perhaps if they're not familiar with that, that is a public sale, or a time when traditionally a blockchain company would do an offering of their native token based on a service or a product that they're going to be offering. And no one particularly knows what that value is going to be once it hits an exchange, but the company will assign a value, and then there's usually a minimum in which investment in which people can buy into that initial coin offering, and that hits the exchange later on, hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, but there's a lot that happens before that. So let's see. Oops, let me advance my slide. So I think that there was so much going on in the world. ICO just became this crazy obsession, and nowhere was that more apparent than in Seoul during 2017. Excuse me. Let me just grab some water. So I think that this quote is so apropos from Vitalik. He just says that as society becomes more and more complex, cheating will in many ways become progressively easier and easier to do and harder to police or even understand. And I think you can go about that in two ways. You can either think that blockchain is evil and you have a lot of fear, and I think that's what we're seeing from a lot of government entities, is that they're trying to corral this because it's so complicated and they just don't understand how blockchain works. So that's in turn made it more difficult to adopt on a mass scale. Or you can just say that society is looking at it from the wrong angle, and hopefully in time they won't see it as this complexity. They won't think about how it works, but just we can focus on the utility, and that's really what's going to bring adoption. This is just a second quote that I wanted to share from Don Tapscott, and I don't know how many of you have read Blockchain Revolution. I read it a couple years ago, but I think that it's worth, I'm planning to read it again. So this is a quote from him, and he has written Blockchain Revolution with his son, Alex Tapscott. And he just goes on to say, we believe that blockchain technology could be an important tool for protecting, preserving humanity and the rights of every human being, a means of communicating the truth, distributing prosperity, and as a network rejects the fraudulent transactions of rejecting those early cancerous cells from a society that can grow into the unthinkable. And I think that speaks to so many levels of what many of us who are working in the blockchain industry hope that it can be, that it can work to reject fraudulent transactions, that it can be here to identify misinterpretation, errors, and just fraud overall. I think that is the original intention behind why we created, or why blockchain was created in the first place. Okay, and just going back to ICOs, and I think people are on either end of the spectrum to the previous quote that I alluded to here with Vitalik, is people are either thinking that this is going to be completely revolutionary, or it's a scam. So I'm not sure where today's audience falls, but I have some additional perspective to share, and maybe you can formulate your opinion further. So leading down into what is really going on in Korea, and I pulled this quote actually from one of the shows that we did in Seoul, Korea with Crypto Trader. And Erica is one of the community leaders and PR and marketing. So she's hosted many Western companies that were looking to make an entry into the Korea market. And she just said, in sum, crypto is crazy in Korea, which I think just shows the sentiment that people didn't really understand why it was so popular in this perceived small economy and why it was being adopted. So let's dive into my hypothesis here. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is that if you look at Korean won and how it's being traded against Bitcoin, is that it is ranked the third. So after the US dollar and after the Japanese yen, that Korean won is the third largest national currency that's traded against BTC, even though Korea is a tiny economy and is nowhere near the GDP of the US, Europe, or Japan. It's really making a name for itself here in Korea. And a third of South Korean workers, so not to say, a third of the entire society, but those that are currently working and employed, in 2017, they were crypto investors. And you'll see from some of my later slides that only appears to be on the rise. Average investment size is about $5,260 US per investor. And I think it makes sense that the risk takers or the early adopters are in their 20s and 30s. But it's also interesting because really seeing people who are in their 20s and 30s making a name for themselves in crypto, and seeing a lot of success early on, which has caught the attention of Korean culture, because it is also typical in Korean society for people to live with their parents until their 30s because they want to save money, and that's just the cultural norm. But that's not the case when they're making bukus of dollars on crypto. So this slide goes to further illustrate my point, which is that if you look here, the chart starts in 2013. I know it's really tiny, but it starts in 2013 and then it goes until November 2019. And it's just illustrating the local Bitcoins that are being traded and the volume at peer-to-peer sites. And I think what's really interesting is that 2017 was seen as the ICO boom, and really when things were really making a lot of headlines. And even though there might not have been as many headlines at the end of 2019, it still showed no signs of slowing down until 2020. So I just think that that's really interesting to show what is going on in Korea, and more about the local market. So one of the perspectives is, why did this all start? And there's this hypothesis that there's a crypto cafe culture. So in Seoul, there are 18,000 cafes, which if you compare that to New York City, there's only approximately 3,389. Which you might say, well, Seoul's a bigger city, but in fact, Seoul's only, if you Google it, Seoul's population is only 1 million larger than New York City. So if you compare 8.5 million population in city center versus 9.5, it's really so many more cafes. And what happens at these cafes is really interesting. And apparent in 2017 is you would go into the cafe and everyone's gossiping. And what can you hear people talking about, which is crypto. It wasn't just people in their 20s and 30s. I mean, that was the majority, you can tell from the trading, but also people in their 60s, 70s were talking about Ethereum, Ripple, BTC on a daily basis, and you could hear that if you're going into cafes. And I think even today, if you go into a cafe in New York City, you're not going to hear that. But in Korea, it just seemed to be on the lips of every person who was drinking coffee, and so it just perpetuated this FOMO around getting in on crypto at the time. And I think that these headlines, which I think everybody here has seen, these moon boys, we might call them, but in Korea, they really had a profound effect, like I said, because it was very unusual for someone in their 20s or 30s to be making a name for themselves economically. So Remy Kim is thought to be the youngest person to own a Rolls Royce, and he's 29. There's also this Ethereum fever in Korea, which led to local prices hitting 30 to 50% above the global average, which was insane. So if you could, in 2017, most people, whether they were a Korean citizen or not, could get onto Korean exchanges. That has since changed. They made it a lot more restrictive in 2019. And to where you had to prove citizenship to get on a lot of the exchanges. But at the time, everyone was trying to log in and create accounts with a South Korean exchange, which was really interesting, just to get that, what they called the kimchi premium. Also, you're just seeing an endorsement from the largest organizations, Samsung, Kakao, which is, I'd say 98% adoption of the local messaging service, if you're not familiar with Kakao. Dunamu, which is a fintech company. They're all committed and have made multiple announcements about blockchain payments and services that they'll be offering through their corporations. Also, the Google of Korea, which is called Naver, has also committed to blockchain technologies and creating payment portals through their services. So just a huge wave in Korea. And I think all of that momentum built into the ICO mania and led it to be the craziness and what it was. So I also like to take a look at the debate, which is, should this craziness have been regulated? And I think that if you're in the industry, it's very common to say, well, it's a self-regulated industry. It doesn't need outside regulators. But I guess I just want to also volley that point on the opposite side a bit more. I mean, if you're in the industry, you could say that it is self-regulated and it can be much more validated. Some people have even compared it to a more established market like the fine art market, where you have to be validated by top dealers, buyers, artists in the fine art market in order to have a chance to break in. And the same is true in blockchain in 2019, 2020, is if you're going to be breaking in, you have to be validated or else you're not going to be successful. Which I think is shown a maturation since 2017 and the whole ICO boom, is that you didn't necessarily have to show as much validation to be success and do $1 million of a raise. So let's turn the debate to how that played out a bit in Korea ICOs versus the USA, which, legally the US couldn't do an ICO because of security risks and issues from the SEC. But if you take a look at this timeline, so ICON, which was seen as one of the biggest ICOs in Korea, is still listed in the top 100 that's being traded today, was at 42.7 million in September 2017. So that was really at the height of things. And then Glossver Icon, they went to 22.9 million in May 2018. They were one of the I guess I'd say later Korean successes. And then after that, we really started to see crypto winter take place in Korea. Kodak, which I think anybody is familiar with, is used to be one of America's largest companies. They made a press announcement, and that press announcement and planning for their token led them to raise $500 million through their stock. Long Island iced tea, which is actually a non-alcoholic beverage, it's speculated that they raised about 114 million. And so those announcements happened in January 2018, and it was highly criticized. And I think that is what really caught the attention of a lot of regulators in the US. I mean, if you zoom out, it's a little bit harder to see, but remember, Kodak and Long Island iced tea made their announcements in January 2018. And so you can see a clear spike here against Kodak's stock. I mean, as you might be familiar, Kodak's film is what they were most famous for, and they've had a lot of issues reinventing themselves. So it appears that they're trying to do that with their release of the Kodak coin and how that can help photographers. I mean, that was how they purported it. I heard them speak in Seoul in 2018. It was really interesting because they were one of the few large established corporations. All of the other speakers that were on the stage at that particular conference were all brand new startup blockchain companies. And Kodak was actually the only veteran in terms of being an established company. Well, I will give Kodak credit, is they did have a plan. They did map things out. They did release, I think they called it their yellow paper. So they did have a plan and a roadmap in place, whereas if you look at Long Island Iced Tea, is they simply changed their name from Long Island Iced Tea Corp to Long Blockchain Corp. And that is what led to their spike in January 2018. They didn't have a roadmap for how blockchain was going to transform their industry or their supply chain. They just changed their name, and that alone seemed to lead to their spike. So, you know, was that purely press? We'll let you be the judge on that one. But just a few other points that I'd like to go into is there were, I think, some longer term ramifications here with the SEC paying much closer attention to what's going on because of what they're seeing in the stock market, on NASDAQ. And that, I think, led to a lot of restrictions for what companies were allowed to do in the US. So to me, this is just, you know, an illustration of the nascent industry. You can be the judge on if it was malicious intent or not. Certainly Kodak has yet to release their MVP, even though it's been in the works for over a year. Long Blockchain Corp, I mean, since this announcement from December to January, they have yet to make any headway in their blockchain technology or releases. And so I think that has led to further skepticism within the US on how this can really be beneficial to society. Okay. So just checking on time here. I guess, you know, in what my point here in bringing all this information to you is to just make your own assumptions, dig into what you really believe ICOs can do, and if they're necessary for companies that are already established, like Kodak, Long Island Iced Tea. I mean, do they need to do an additional raise to create their projects or not? So you're seeing companies like these Fortune 500 companies do ICOs, and you're also seeing in 2017 companies that had 4 or 5 people do a raise of 20 to 30 million in Korea. So I think it's very different, the reasoning and the likelihood for success if a small unknown startup is going to be able to deliver on their promises, as well as a large established institution that has never done anything like this before. Okay. Oops. And I think just to touch further on where we stand today with ICOs, they have really fallen out of vogue since, I'd say, the end of 2018. And what's interesting is companies, especially blockchain companies, haven't been in less of a need to raise money or to create new projects. So they have also found new marketing tactics to do something that isn't seen as so negatively, right? You've heard of IEOs, which are initial exchange offerings. I even talked to a company in November that was doing an IFO. So I think the joke is that they're just going to keep going down the alphabet until it gets worn down. But I think that if we're just to look at the intent behind it, is there a long-term utility in what they're creating or the service that they're offering? And if there's utility, then I do believe that it will be successful and that they're going to stand the test of time. If there's no reason for them to add blockchain, like I really can't understand why Long Island Iced Tea is adding it to their entire name. Certainly, I think there would be places where it could make sense on their supply chain, but I don't know if that's necessary for them to change their entire company name over. Because there would be advantages for them to use blockchain in some areas, but then in others it would just slow things down. Okay. I put this slide in here for, I guess, further where we're seeing blockchain come into place today versus just the ICO boom, which initially the ICO boom was just a way to make money into the marketplace. But as people started to become more mature and using smart contracts and really enabling the technology behind blockchain, you're seeing them do things like tracking diamonds and ensuring that, for example, if you have a product like a diamond, the immutability on the chain, and that it is in fact the cut, carat, clarity, color that it says it is. And if they're going to be making any change, then it has to be verified. And I'm really excited to see how that is going to take place further in the US, especially with deeds and public and private agreements. I still think that we have a long way to go, but I really think that this is where we're going to see the biggest advancements, just between contracts and the immutability and the security that's led there. And then I guess just to wrap up before we dive into questions, I made this slide for fun, just if we wanted to speculate on where things have gone in crypto and how that parallels to the history of credit. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with credit, but it's built on trust. Back in oops, I'm sorry. Let me go back here. Okay. Yeah, so like I was saying, back in the Mesopotamian period, about 2000 BC, they had their first loans, and that was built on trust. So you had farmers with their seeds, and rather than waiting until the end of harvest because they needed supplies for their crop, that they were paid a monetary value for what those seeds' perceived value would be. And so I think that parallels over to the Satoshi white paper and how a token can represent monetary value in the marketplace. Okay, bear with me here. And then I think that also is interesting how you see it change over to interest rates being set. So you have this credit, and now other people in power want to be able to benefit from what's going on. You don't want just people, let's say your nobility on the land wants to be able to profit from what's going on. So the king, he is regulating the interest rates that are being set, and then he's able to take a profit. So that was the Babylonian king who was the first one to set interest rates. And that was about in 1754. So I guess I also provide these dates to just show you how long this transition took. But if the Satoshi white paper came out in 2008, and then governments are seeking restrictions, certainly in 2018 in the US, I'm not sure, I can't speak necessarily to every government area, but certainly in 2018, it's starting to make headlines on and what the restrictions can be for crypto. Then if you look to temples, they were prominent in the community. And so they started to act as banks in society and issue notes. So then, the first exchanges, I think, came along very quickly after the white paper. So I even want to say in 2009, there were a number of exchanges that were going on. They were very difficult to get onto with, I guess, average knowledge, but they did exist for people to be able to trade on with fiat and on and off ramps. So I guess what I'm just trying to illustrate is, these was taking hundreds of years in between each revolution. And here we're just seeing this in a matter of years. So how quickly can this continue to go if we're looking at the history of credit as a parallel look into the change of what we can expect into crypto? And then in time, lending was outlawed. It was said in both the Christian and in the Quran that it wasn't ethical to do. However, the Jews did continue to lend and charge interest, and then that led to the Jews' persecution, and it became outlawed. But because of its utility, it came back, and it came back into prominence, and that's why we still have lending today. So, just looking at, we do have attempts in outlawing crypto. In the US, it's notable with US Representative Brad Sherman. He spoke on that in the middle of 2019 very publicly and making headlines about that. And I think we can see that echoed throughout the world. However, Korea has made a lot of headlines, and their president, as of spring this year, they have legalized crypto. So perhaps that revolution is happening. And I mean, could we say the COVID-19 revolution? Can this spark a greater utility than the perceived risks? I just think that would be interesting. And, I'm just imagining what could happen and playing around with this timeline with the history of credit versus the future of crypto. But I think that it could be interesting telling. I mean, they do say history repeats itself, right? So if you look at how cards transform the use of credit, I still think that it's not widely adopted, but there are many more cards which are coming into place and allowing a point of service to happen with crypto. And then online lending speeds up everything with the history of credit. And that happened back in the early 1980s. And I think that that's when we're going to hit global acceptance here with crypto. Is there's just going to be so much transformation happening that everybody's going to be using it, whether they know it or not. But yeah, that was me just looking into my crystal ball and thinking, what have we really seen in the evolution of crypto? Where could it possibly be going? Even though we've had areas of ICOs and marketing hype and maybe not a lot of value, I think that is going to just shake out, and it's shaken out very quickly if you compare that to the millennia that I had to go through with the history of credit versus where we are currently with the evolution of crypto. But yeah, that was me pattering on for, I guess, close to 30 minutes, but I'd love to just open things up for discussion. Let me see if I can stop screen sharing here and go back to seeing everyone's lovely faces. 1 second. Yeah. Should we transition over to Q&A?
Hey, so I guess I'll start. So you talked about a lot about credit and lending, and I guess my question would be about how is DeFi perceived in Korea? Because I think right now there's a bit of a mania around DeFi that reminds me of the 2017 a bubble with a lot of marketing action, a lot of gains around those cryptos. So how is it perceived in the Korean market?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Right now, I think that the banks, banks in Korea, in comparison to my use in the US, are very antiquated. So just to be able to make a global remittance payment from the US to Korea, or to Korea to the US, it takes about an hour. You have to physically go into the location and wait in line, and then they have to get their manager's approval and their manager's approval. So to do anything, a lot of the times it takes a lot of physical in-person they still use a lot of the, what's the acronym? RSIDs, those scramblers of codes where you have to, and I've seen that used in European countries still today, but in the US, I think that's very rare for you to do a banking transaction on yourself. I mean, it's very interesting to me because you can quickly apply for a loan in the US online versus in Korea, where it's just so cumbersome to get through the security wall. You just have to physically go in person to prove your identity a lot of the time. And one of the reasons for that is it's such a small country, and everybody has the technology that they just sort of enforce you to be able to go in. Also because about 50% of Korea's population is in Seoul. So they have access to banks and to go into a physical location. So I think that if we're thinking about where banks are going to be, they're not going to be the ones who are propelling the DeFi movement. That's really going to be companies like Samsung, Kakao. So these organizations and these entities are fully embracing blockchain, and they're going to be the ones, I think, who are doing so first they're just going to have payments, right? So if you think about a messaging app, you'll buy some stickers, you'll have the tokens, and then I think that's really going to be what's going to propel loans in the future, is they're going to have such a high user base in Korea. So if you look at Kakao already, or the Google of Korea, they already have 98% of the marketplace. They already have the users, they have their identification, they have their information. And a lot of times they have access to their credit reports. So I really think that that's where you're going to see the DeFi movement take place in Korea, is not with traditional financial entities, but with these corporations, because they're just able to pivot a lot quicker.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Okay, Lindsay, I would like to ask a question. In your presentation, you have mentioned that the impact of blockchain in supply chain. There are many sectors where blockchain will bring value in this type. What do you think is the best advantage or benefits for supply chain? Traceability, fraud, cost savings for enterprise? And where are the companies investing more in blockchain in areas about supply chains?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the areas and one of the biggest challenges is figuring out where blockchain is going to help the process rather than hinder it. So, I mean, if you think about something, I use diamonds in my presentation, so let's go back to diamonds. If you think of how many times that diamond is going to be changing hands, whether it's created in a lab or whether it's created in a mine, before it gets to the end user, you just think each time it changes hands, it needs to be verified. But does that process need to go back to blockchain every time? And if it does go back, or can it go back in a grouping? And how is that going to enable the speed in which it's taking place? So I think that definitely security is going to be easily addressed. And verification, but I think that it's the ease of use and where it's necessary and where it's not necessary for it to be put on blockchain is going to be one of the biggest challenges for companies, because so let's say that there are also messages confirming that back and forth. So I do think that you need to know that it goes from point A to point B, but there's also going to be a lot of things that happen in between A and B. And how many of those messages or certificates also need to be placed on blockchain? Because once it's placed, I mean, it's going to be very difficult for it to be deleted. And because of that, it's going to have to run back through that whole chain every time. So I think that that's going to be a large challenge, is for companies to figure out what's necessary rather than just get so excited and enamored that this is going to be secure, this is going to be verifiable, and putting everything on the blockchain to really honing in on what the priority is and what's going to make sense for years to come. You know, I haven't had as much personal experience to know which companies are fully embracing it. I've seen it where it's used poorly many times, which is that there are companies that I happen to meet at conferences that have set claims to having diamonds or having gold or having these vaults, and they're talking about using the whole supply chain. And they're very well versed in how that can work and how that can benefit. But then when you get down to it and ask for, you know, to personally verify or to see any of this yourself, you know, they're lacking. So I think that that's maybe a challenge, and where we're going to see prominence take place is there have been so many false claims to using blockchain for the supply chain for mined goods, especially, that I think that they still have a long way to go, and it's going to be a real challenge. But let's see, where have I seen it? Temco, I mean, they've used it with a lot of their suppliers out of Korea. So I guess if you're interested personally in finding out more about their success, I do think Temco has seen a lot of success with the supply chain and blockchain.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier on in your presentation, I think you said that ICOs since about 2019, 2020 are comparable to the fine art market, where they need to be validated in order to have any real success. Who's the company or the public body behind validating them? How does that work? Or is it just a general group of people that would validate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question, Phil. So I guess based on my personal experience and what I've seen transition through the ICO time is that a company like Glossifer, AKON in Korea, they raised, you know, 22 million in 2018. And it's interesting because they did that without a lot of technical gravitas. So they didn't necessarily have a lot of people who were familiar with the technology and could understand how this was going to really play out with their user base. They had a grand vision of how this could impact the world, how this could change society. They had a lot of prominent executives from previous large entities in Korea. And so they were able to get a lot of early press, but their detailed roadmap and their ability to execute, which is seen, I think, through just their technical abilities, really was lacking. And so if you look today at where AKON is and where Glossifer has catapulted their technology, they still really haven't been able to transition it out to mainstream in Korea like they said they were going to do around the world. So I think that people have become much more savvy, and where that's being validated is in the success of their ICO. So whether they're getting people to buy their tokens and the amount at which people are buying in, I mean, you're just not seeing, when people are asking for more than a few million, it was really scoffed at in Korea. And you know, the hard cap for ICOs, I think, was unheard of, above 10 million after crypto winter in the end of 2018. So you just, where it used to be that you didn't necessarily need to have a lot of technical abilities and a defined roadmap for how that's going to affect your users, I think that's being verified by the fact that their tokens just aren't selling. And now I think Korea, it's going to be really interesting because they have been mapping out legalization within crypto. It's still very new. I mean, they passed that in April, I believe President Moon did. So I think we're going to also see some regulation there from government entities, but they haven't yet figured that out.
Okay, so it's like a consensus from the people who are buying it rather than a particular individual or person verifying it. So,
Right, putting their stamp of approval, exactly.
got you. Thank you.
린스, 안녕하세요.
네.
한국말을
안녕하세요.
잘해요? 말할 수 있어요? 저는 한국에 3년 동안 살았다고 14년에 비트코인 대해서 처음에 들었어요. 14년에 아주대학교 졸업했어요. 가톨릭 대학교 유학하고 그 다음에 아주대학교 공부했어요. Just what I was saying, that I was living in Korea for 3 years and I speak Korean. And in 2014 was the first time when I actually heard about Bitcoin, and it was in Korea. And yeah, I actually can relate to a lot of stories. You know, you said in the beginning of your presentation about young people trying to get into crypto, about young investors. Well, the reason was actually back in the days, I was also in my early 20s. I also used to work in one of the Beijing coffee shops, and actually was the place where I heard about Bitcoin. And yeah,
Right,
and
yeah, prime example.
yeah, and actually because I was in this student community, a lot of young people around me was studying and actually doing 1 or 2 jobs in as a part-time. It's actually very hard to actually get enough money for living in Seoul. It's very competitive city. And yeah, I would say this was one of the first and very good drivers to make money very quick. And actually I remember myself mining Bitcoin in my laptop and dormitory.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and my roommate was complaining for the noise, and actually I saw the Bitcoin price was very low, and it was like I was not making it. And actually and I gave up this idea. I had a free electricity and a lot of free time. So yeah, it was a very first and very hurting experience after a few years. But yeah, I actually still love crypto very much. And you were saying that some people, I think, blaming blockchain and crypto for cheating and stealing money. I think, like in recent days, I've become more and more philosophical. I was thinking about this as well. And I would say blaming blockchain and crypto for, being used as a tool for stealing or fooling people and getting their money is a little bit wrong. It's the same as probably is blaming internet for porn or for hackers. Probably we shouldn't just blame the technology itself. We should probably blame the people and the society. It's like it's not the technology which harms, it's the people who are actually do something bad. So yeah, we cannot fully fully ban it, but we can limit it to some extent. And I think this when we'll limit this, same as we'll limit illegal transactions between the banks, the crypto will become so much better place. Yeah, and one last thing I would say, you were saying about alphabets and ICO, IEO. I heard about IGO, IFO.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and recently the new trend in Chinese exchanges was heard of is ISO, initial social offering.
Wow, okay, that's further down the alphabet than I've gone.
Yeah. So it's limited token sales among the users on exchanges. So they actually get a quota. So you cannot buy, for example, more than 10,000 US dollars worth tokens. Yeah, once. Yeah, so I think it's very interesting. It's I like the way how it's been very creative. First on how they can squeeze more money out, and second about actually develop the instruments which do not exist on traditional fundraising instruments like crowdfunding, IPO and so on.
Yeah, but why do you think that they changed the name? Do you think that it's just to put a different marketing spin on it? Do you think there's any utility behind calling it an ISO or an ICO?
Well, no one invests in IEO anymore because ICO because it's now it's in the public opinion, it's connected with a bad thing. IO is just like maybe not that profitable after 2019. I would say after 2018, it's less profitable because exchanges have less volume and less users, and there's simply so many exchanges already that they cannot actually provide significant funds for one exchange for one project unless it's very good. And yeah, so they try to attract like keeping riding the wave and, you know, invent something else. Yeah, so probably we'll see more such things coming. Yeah, I'm very interested. So yeah, my question, sorry for taking so much your time and yeah, talking. I have a question. Can you name three the most successful projects this year, maybe last year, which are still very good and very promising in Korea and Korean market?
Oh gosh, I wish I could. I mean, definitely not this year. I have been out of Korea. I'm actually calling in from the USA right now. I'm in sunny North Carolina, but I think I am definitely waiting. I won't say that these companies have proved their success yet. Let's see. I'm not sure if I can name three, but I think we're all holding our breath around Kakao and what they're going to do with blockchain, because they've made announcements, they've made partnerships. Who did they just do a new partnership? They did one with they're doing a large PR push that they just announced with BCW Group, which is a big PR group out of Hong Kong. So I thought that was interesting, that Kakao, you know, they've released their main net. They did that last year. And so now they're really working on their global expansion. So they still haven't proven themselves yet, but I think that a lot of people are very, because they already have 98% of adoption in Korea. I think everybody's excited about what Kakao is going to do, and they already have people's trust because they've been using it for messaging. So I think everyone's holding their breath there, and they have been making waves. And I guess in comparison to a lot of the companies that did raises and ICOs, they've been able to stay relatively close to their roadmap. Let's see. You know, it's interesting because you asked me about who seems to have done well, and I can think of so many that have disappointed. I think like Hyundai had made some announcements. I was just thinking and they really haven't got anything to prove. I mean, Naver, I also think people are really excited about, because with just since it is the Google of Korea, and they already have the same, you know, 98% adoption in users and people who have for a long time used personal blogs on their site, which is how Naver came into popularity. It wasn't just through their search engine, but people created their own blog sites and websites through Naver. It's just going to be so easy for them to integrate and have blockchain technology in place without any of their users knowing. So I think that's the other one, that they have seemed to make alliances with the right international groups and stick to a realistic roadmap. You know, but it's also interesting because those are two of the largest companies in Korea. Whereas I think these companies and a lot of them that did ICOs, they had no experience with technology. They didn't have a key technology advisors in one of the top 3 roles. So they were, you know, just using, I guess what I would say, old schematics to build a new engine, which seemed to have failed them in their ability to go from vision to usability. So yeah, those are the 2 that I will leave you with. There are so many more that are clogging my brain on disappointments, but those 2 I'm excited about where they can go. Yeah. Maybe we have time for one more. I don't want to leave you out, Dimitra, if you want to ask a question or add any insights. No? Okay. Well, I know we're at the top of the hour, so just want to thank OKEx again for inviting me. I did put out my Twitter handle, CryptoJew1, if you guys want to send me messages, or I'd love to connect with you guys and hear from you as your blockchain journey continues.